The wind, a blade whetted on distant, ice-capped peaks, sliced through Ilara's threadbare tunic, raising goose flesh on her already trembling arms. Each gust carried the scent of pine and damp earth, smells that usually meant the comforting proximity of home, but now only amplified her desolation. Home was a word that had fractured, its meaning scattered like the dry leaves skittering across the forest floor around her. Her mother's face, usually a mask of pinched disapproval, had been strangely blank as she'd pushed Ilara forward into the deepening shadows of the woods. "You're a curse, a drain," her father's voice, rough as unsanded wood, echoed in her memory, the words a fresh lashing. "Stay here. Don't follow," and then they had turned, two diminishing figures, swallowed by the indifferent trees, leaving her with nothing but the rising terror in her chest and the icy premonition of being utterly, irrevocably alone. She was small, Ilara, barely 7 summers old, with eyes the color of moss after rain, eyes that had seen too much unkindness and too little warmth. The hunger gnawing at her belly was a familiar ache, but this was different, sharpened by a cold that seeped into her bones, a cold that promised a terrible stillness. She'd cried, at first, a raw, broken sound that the vast forest absorbed without a tremor. Her tears left hot trails on her chilled cheeks, freezing almost instantly. The forest, with its ancient trees standing like grim, silent judges, offered no comfort, only an echoing emptiness that mirrored the hollow in her heart. She was a burden, they had said. Worthless. The words clung to her like the grasping thorns that tore at her ankles as she stumbled deeper, though she knew not where she was going, only that she couldn't stay where their departing figures had last been. The sun, a weak, indifferent eye in the grey sky, began its descent, painting the woods in hues of purple and blood orange, colors too beautiful for such a brutal betrayal. Her small hand clutched a smooth, grey stone she'd picked up from the riverbank near their hovel, the only solid thing in a world that had dissolved into fear. The stone was cold, like everything else. Like the future, she thought, if she even had one. He found her as the last vestiges of twilight surrendered to the encroaching night, a small, huddled shape at the base of an old oak, its gnarled roots like arthritic fingers. Caleb moved through the gloaming with the practiced quiet of a man who knew the woods and his own sorrow intimately. His axe, usually for felling stubborn trees or splitting logs for the meager fire that awaited him in his empty cottage, felt heavy in his hand, a counterweight to the hollowness in his chest that had been his constant companion since Martha's passing. Grief was a stubborn tenant, refusing to be evicted. He'd been checking his snares, hoping for a rabbit to stave off the worst of his own hunger, when a sound, thin and fragile, had pierced the evening's silence. It wasn't the cry of any night creature he recognized. It was a human sound, choked with despair. His heart, a tired, scarred muscle, gave an unfamiliar lurch. He followed the sound, pushing aside low-hanging branches, his boots crunching softly on the frosted leaves, until he saw her. A child. Here, in the desolate heart of the Whisperwood, where even seasoned hunters trod with caution after dusk. She was barely more than a babe, her face pale and tear-streaked, her lips blue. For a moment, he could only stare, a torrent of questions and a surge of disbelief washing over him. Who would do such a thing? Leave a child to the wolves, to the killing frost. The wind sighed through the branches above, a mournful sound that seemed to articulate the cruelty of it all. Ilara didn't stir as he approached, her small body curled tight, as if trying to shrink away from the world's harshness. He knelt, his joints creaking, and gently touched her shoulder. Her skin was like ice. "Little one," he whispered, his voice hoarse, unused to softness. Her eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes wide with a terror so profound it struck him to the core. He saw Martha in those eyes, for a fleeting, painful instant, the same vulnerability, the same silent plea. His own life was a threadbare tapestry of hardship, another mouth to feed was a burden he could scarcely imagine bearing. Yet, to leave her here? That was a betrayal of something fundamental, something he hadn't realized still lived within him. The struggle was brief, a fierce, internal skirmish. He thought of Martha's kindness, the way she'd rescue injured birds, her unwavering belief in the good that could be found even in the leanest of times. He pulled off his worn woolen cloak, the one that still carried the faint scent of wood smoke and Martha's lavender, and wrapped it around the child's shivering form. "Don't you worry now," he murmured, more to himself than to her, the words a vow. "I've got you." He lifted her carefully. She weighed almost nothing, a bundle of cold bones and fear. The journey back to his cottage was slow, each step measured, his mind racing, the small, cold weight in his arms both a terrible accusation against the world and a fragile spark of something akin to purpose. The cottage was a single room, walls chinked with dried moss and mud, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke and old sorrows. To Ilara, drifting in and out of a chilled stupor, it was a haven. Caleb laid her gently on his own cot, a rough-hewn bed covered with a patched quilt, the only soft thing in the sparsely furnished space. He moved with an uncharacteristic urgency, stoking the embers in the hearth until a small, brave flame leaped up, casting flickering shadows that danced on the rough timber walls. The warmth, hesitant at first, began to push back the invasive cold that had claimed her. She watched him through slitted eyes, a man whose face was etched with lines of worry and a deep, settled sadness, yet whose hands were surprisingly gentle as he coaxed a few spoonfuls of thin, warm broth between her lips. The taste was bland, but it was sustenance, a promise against the emptiness. She didn't speak, couldn't. The words were frozen somewhere deep inside, along with the memory of her mother's indifferent shove. Fear was still her closest companion, but it was a different fear now, not the stark terror of abandonment, but the wary apprehension of the unknown. This man, with his quiet movements and sorrowful eyes, was an enigma. He hadn't hurt her. He had brought her into the light, into the warmth. Caleb worked methodically, his actions economical. He wrung out a cloth in warm water and gently wiped her face, cleaning away the dirt and dried tears. He found an old, soft shirt of Martha's, much too large for Ilara, but clean and smelling faintly of sun-dried herbs, and carefully dressed her in it. He spoke little, occasional murmurs that were more like the cooing of a forest dove than human speech, sounds meant to soothe, not to demand a response. "There now, little bird," he'd say, tucking the quilt more snugly around her. "Safe now." Ilara's breath hitched, a tiny, broken sound. Safe? The word felt alien, a language she didn't understand. Her parents had been her safety, once, or so she'd been taught to believe, until their love had curdled into something sharp and cold. She closed her eyes, the firelight painting red patterns on the insides of her eyelids. The man sat by the fire, his silhouette hunched, watching her. He was a stranger, a widower living on the frayed edges of survival, yet in his presence, a tiny, almost imperceptible seed of something other than fear began to stir within her. It was too fragile to be called hope, perhaps just a lessening of despair. He was a puzzle, his kindness a stark contrast to the cruelty she had known. The wind howled outside, but inside, the fire crackled, a small defiance against the vast, uncaring night. Days bled into one another, marked by the pale winter sun that struggled to penetrate the dense canopy surrounding Caleb's isolated cottage. Ilara remained mostly silent, a small shadow in the corner of the room, her moss-green eyes following Caleb's every move. He never pressed her to speak, offering food, a piece of coarse bread, a bowl of thin stew, a roasted root, with a quiet patience that was a balm to her fractured spirit. He'd talk sometimes, a low rumble of a voice, telling her about the forest, the names of the trees, the way the snow felt on his face in the deep winter. He spoke of Martha, his voice softening, a bittersweet melody of remembrance. She loved the first snowdrops, he said one morning, looking out the small, grimy window. Said they were like hope pushing through the cold earth. Ilara didn't respond, but she tucked the words away, like the smooth grey stone she still kept clutched in her hand beneath the quilt. She watched him mend his worn boots, his brow furrowed in concentration, his large, calloused hands surprisingly deft. She saw the way he shared his meager portions, always ensuring she had enough, even if it meant he went with less. Slowly, tentatively, the tight knot of fear inside her began to loosen, strand by painstaking strand. One afternoon, while Caleb was outside chopping wood, the rhythmic thud of his axe a steady beat in the quiet air, Ilara dared to explore her small world. She touched the rough-hewn table, the cool, smooth surface of a clay bowl. On a small shelf, there was a crudely carved wooden bird, its paint faded. She picked it up, its lightness surprising. It felt precious. When Caleb returned, his arms laden with firewood, he found her holding the bird, her expression unreadable. He simply smiled, a rare, fleeting upturn of his lips. Martha carved that. She had a gift for such things. He didn't try to take it from her. Later that evening, as he mended a tear in her too large shirt with clumsy, unpracticed stitches, she whispered her first word to him, so soft he almost missed it. Cold, he looked up, startled, then a gentle understanding dawned in his eyes. He reached for the quilt, pulling it higher around her shoulders. Little bird. It's a cold night. But the fire's strong, a small, almost imperceptible connection had been forged, a single thread in the vast emptiness. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was the beginning of its shadow. The word, once spoken, seemed to unlock something. The next day, she pointed to the water bucket. Water? He nodded, a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the fire. He was teaching her words, and she, in her own silent way, was teaching him how to feel again. The fragile peace of their shared solitude was inevitably disturbed by the tendrils of the outside world. A few weeks after Ilara's arrival, a grizzled trapper named Silas, who occasionally traded pelts with Caleb for carved wooden implements, stumbled upon the cottage. His eyes, sharp and assessing, widened at the sight of Ilara, a small, pale bloom in the widower's stark dwelling. "Well now, Caleb," Silas drawled, his voice like stones grinding together, "where'd this little sprig come from?" "Didn't know you'd taken to fostering." Caleb's jaw tightened. "She was lost. I found her in the whisperwood." Silas's gaze lingered on Ilara, a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "Lost, you say? Or left?" The unspoken accusation hung heavy in the air. Whispers, Caleb knew, would soon follow Silas back to the distant village, tales of the reclusive widower and the mysterious child. Ilara, sensing the tension, shrank back, her eyes wide with a familiar fear. Caleb placed a protective hand on her shoulder. "She's with me now, Silas. That's all that matters." His tone brooked no argument, but the encounter left a residue of unease. Later, Ilara had a nightmare, thrashing and crying out incoherent words, her small body rigid with terror. Caleb sat by her side, murmuring soothing nonsense until her shivers subsided, until her breathing evened out. He saw the ghosts of her past in the sheen of sweat on her brow, in the raw fear that clung to her even in sleep. He learned nothing concrete about her wicked parents, or the specific horrors they had inflicted, only that the wounds were deep, etched into the very fabric of her being. He felt a surge of protective anger, fierce and unfamiliar, towards those who had harmed her, and a renewed determination to shield this fragile life. He began to actively teach her, not just words, but the quiet language of the forest, the rhythm of a life lived in tune with the seasons rather than the whims of cruel people. He showed her which berries were safe to eat, the scarlet jewels of wintergreen, the tart burst of late cranberries hidden beneath the snow. He pointed out the tracks of deer and fox, the silent flight of an owl. "The forest provides, Ilara," he'd say, his voice gentle, "if you know how to listen, how to look." It's not always a harsh master. He was trying to overwrite her fear of the wilderness, the place of her abandonment, with a sense of wonder, of connection. He shared stories of his own youth, of learning the woodcraft from his father, tales of hardship, yes, but also of resilience and simple joys. He spoke more of Martha, too, not with the sharp edge of fresh grief, but with a tender reminiscence, painting a picture of a woman whose spirit, he now realized, echoed in Ilara's quiet tenacity. He taught her to whittle small, simple shapes from scraps of wood, guiding her small hands with his large, scarred ones. Her first creation was a lopsided star, but she held it up to him with a shy pride that made his heart ache. She wasn't just a mouth to feed anymore, a responsibility he'd reluctantly shouldered. She was becoming something more, a quiet presence that filled the echoing spaces in his cottage and in his life. He saw her innate intelligence, her quickness to learn, the way she absorbed everything with a solemn intensity. She was, he realized with a start, a gift, not a burden. A tiny, resilient flower pushing through the frozen earth of his sorrow. The turning point came with the fever. It arrived suddenly, a thief in the night, stealing the faint color from Ilara's cheeks and leaving her burning with an unnatural heat. Her small body trembled, and her breath came in shallow, rasping gasps. Caleb was thrown into a panic he hadn't felt since Martha's final illness. He bathed her forehead with cool water, coaxed sips of willow bark tea between her cracked lips, his hands, usually so steady, fumbling and unsure. For 3 days and nights, he barely slept, watching her wrestle with the illness, her whimpers tearing at his soul. The whisperwood, his sanctuary, suddenly felt menacing, its isolation a curse. He was alone, with no remedy save for the forest's meager offerings and his own desperate prayers. He cursed his poverty, his helplessness. In a moment of lucidity, Ilara's eyes fluttered open, focusing on his anguished face. "Don't leave," she whispered, her voice a thread of sound, her small, hot hand reaching for his. The plea, so raw, so trusting, pierced through his fear. He grasped her hand, holding it tight. "Never, little bird," he choked out, the words a sacred oath. "I'm right here. I won't leave you." He knew, in that moment, that his life was inextricably bound to hers. The thought of her parents, the ones who had left her to die, ignited a cold rage within him. He would not fail her as they had. He would fight for her, with every ounce of his being. Slowly, painstakingly, the fever began to recede. Color returned to Ilara's cheeks, her breathing eased, and the light of awareness rekindled in her moss-green eyes. During her convalescence, something shifted deep within her. The wall of silence she had maintained about her past began to crumble. One evening, as the fire cast dancing shadows and the wind moaned outside, she spoke, her voice small but clear. "They said I was bad," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the flames. "Said I ate too much. That I wasn't worth the keeping." Caleb's heart constricted. He sat beside her on the cot, his presence a solid comfort. "They were wrong, Ilara," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Terribly wrong. You are worth more than all the stars in the sky. You are a gift." He told her about Martha, about how she believed everyone had a light inside them, a precious, unique spark. "Your light is strong, little bird," he said, gently brushing a stray strand of hair from her forehead. "Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise." Tears welled in Ilara's eyes, but they were not tears of fear or despair. They were tears of release, of a dawning, fragile understanding. She leaned her head against his arm, a gesture of trust so profound it made him tremble. In that shared moment of vulnerability, she wasn't just the lost child he had rescued, she was his. And he, the struggling widower, was her protector, her family. The shadows of her past still lingered, but now, for the first time, she felt the stirrings of her own voice, the courage to believe she might, after all, deserve to be loved. The spring arrived tentatively, then with a rush of emerald green and birdsong, transforming the stark forest into a place of burgeoning life. With it came a visitor from the village, a stern-faced woman named Mistress Gable, a self-appointed arbiter of local morals, accompanied by the nervous village elder. Silas's whispers had borne fruit. "Caleb," Mistress Gable began, her voice sharp, "there are concerns. About the child. It's not proper. You, a man alone." Ilara, who had been tending a small patch of herbs Caleb had helped her plant near the cottage door, froze, her eyes darting to Caleb. The old fear, the fear of being taken, of being deemed unworthy again, washed over her. But then she saw Caleb's steady gaze, his hand resting reassuringly on her shoulder. Something new, a spark of defiance she hadn't known she possessed, ignited within her. Before Caleb could speak, Ilara stepped forward, her small chin held high. "He's my father," she declared, her voice surprisingly firm, clear as a spring morning. "He found me when I was lost and cold. He saved me. This is my home." Mistress Gable looked taken aback, the elder shifted uncomfortably. Caleb's heart swelled with a fierce pride. He put his arm around Ilara's shoulders. "She speaks the truth," he said, his voice resonant. "She is my daughter, in all ways that matter. And this is her home, for as long as she wishes it." He met Mistress Gable's gaze without flinching. There was a long, tense silence, broken only by the chirping of a robin. Finally, the elder cleared his throat. "Well, if the child is cared for, and happy," Mistress Gable huffed, but the fight seemed to drain out of her. Perhaps it was Ilara's unexpected courage, or Caleb's quiet dignity, or the undeniable bond between them. They left soon after, their mission unfulfilled, their pronouncements unheard. Ilara looked up at Caleb, a watery smile on her face. He smiled back, a genuine, unburdened smile that reached his eyes. She had chosen. He had chosen. They were family, forged not by blood, but by shared hardship, by unwavering compassion, and by a love as resilient as the forest itself. Life in the small cottage on the edge of the Whisperwood continued, marked by the gentle rhythm of the seasons. The struggles remained, food was often scarce, the winters long and cold. But now, the hardships were faced together, shared burdens that seemed lighter for the sharing. Ilara blossomed. The pinched, fearful look that had haunted her small face was replaced by a quiet serenity, her moss-green eyes now bright with curiosity and a newfound confidence. She learned to read the forest's secrets alongside Caleb, her laughter echoing through the trees where once only her cries had been heard. She filled the cottage with small treasures, unusually shaped stones, vibrant wildflowers, feathers shed by passing birds. She even began to hum tunes, melodies that seemed to spring from a well of joy deep within her. Caleb, too, was transformed. The deep furrows of grief on his face softened, smoothed by the warmth of Ilara's presence. He found purpose in her smiles, in her eagerness to learn, in the simple act of providing for her. His solitude, once a heavy cloak, had been replaced by a companionship that healed the old, aching wounds in his soul. He was no longer just the struggling widower, he was a father. Their home, though humble, was filled with an unspoken love, a deep and abiding sense of belonging. Ilara knew she was no longer the worthless, abandoned child. She was cherished, she was strong, she was home. And as the sun set each evening, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold, casting a warm glow over their small cottage, she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she was exactly where she was meant to be, a testament to the enduring power of kindness in a world that could often be cruel.